You excited for the Super Bowl, dude?
Yeah. Excited to see Taylor Swift. Okay. Every time you bring up football, it's like people are like, "Oh, Taylor Swift, Taylor Swift," and then like people like they love it, they hate it, and I'm embarrassed. I just fell into that trap. Like you just mentioned Super Bowl, and it comes
Even
out of
as
my
a
mouth.
joke.
It comes out, but that's what it is with everyone. Any conversation about football, and I
You know what's
apologize.
funny? You know what's funny is that people online, you see that a lot, but you know, Kansas City has become like the villain of the NFL. So no one actually wants Kansas City to win, even though, yeah,
Well,
Taylor just won her 13th Grammy, and you know it'd be cool if they won the Super Bowl and then got married. That's fine, but I'm more
God.
excited about
Oh
Brock
my God,
Purdy
listen
and the
to you.
Niners and that.
Is that what's
Like,
gonna happen? They're gonna win, and then someone's gonna propose.
I'm sure. I mean, why wouldn't you? You know, it's a pretty strong move. I mean, it's hard to beat that Super Bowl proposal.
That's true. All the fiancés everywhere, like look at their husbands. Why didn't you do that to me for me?
Exactly.
People hate Kansas City though because they're
The new
like
Patriots.
yeah, they've
They're
like
so
been
good.
winning for the last 3 years, 4
Because the
years.
NFL is rigged.
Yeah, here we go. Another thing that someone always brings up when you talk about football.
Conspiracy Corner with Sam Salikov.
Yeah.
No, I like Kansas City. I like Mahomes. I mean, this will be what his third ring by the time he's under 30 still, which is pretty crazy. Um, you know, he's good.
Nice.
No, fourth,
I'm
not third
excited.
ring. Yeah, because they lost to the Niners in 2020, but the Chiefs were in 4 of the last 6 Super Bowls with Mahomes as the starter,
Yeah.
which is pretty insane.
That's
So
like
you got to give him
Patriots
props for that.
Patriots Tom Brady status right
Yeah,
there.
yeah, it's pretty wild, pretty wild.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm excited for it though. Okay, let's get into it. We're gonna kick it off with a tweet you had about optimistic UI in
Server,
Next.js,
server component, not Next.js.
Server components,
Server
not
components.
Next.js.
Yeah, server components. Okay,
Toronto JS.
Toronto JS. It will work in Next.js. I think there was like a whatever. We'll get into this in a second, but yeah, well, it applies to Next.js. It applies to any server components.
Cool. We haven't talked about this in person yet, and I liked last week because I kind of came in cold. So let's do that here. You want to set the stage for the demo?
Yeah, sure. So there is a new hook in that will be in the next version of React. It is in React Canary right now, but I think it's going to be merged into the next version of React. That's called useOptimistic. And the whole point of it is it lets you get optimistic updates when you are invoking server actions. So that's kind of why this hook exists. Before we kind of go into like how it works and how I used it, I'm kind of excited to talk to you about this because my thing was just like a quick demo that took a few hours to throw together. And I know you've done the optimistic updates with Remix, and I haven't done that. And then I know like Ryan did that video where he makes Trello, and he's got optimistic updates, and he's like dragging and dropping cards across lanes, and like there's requests that are canceling, and everything just seamlessly works. And so I'm interested to hear kind of your take, having done the remix stuff, and how it compares to this. Because the way I use this, it kind of feels like a low level tool. Like I would not want to be in like a cage match with like you or Ryan, like promoting this, even though I
Right.
think this hook is cool. I'm not like pooing this hook. But I feel like
It's
most
a building
React hooks,
block. It's not like a high level end user API.
Exactly. It was very cool to use it. So I guess we can get into that. But again,
Nice.
definitely like if there's something that reminds you of Remix, definitely like bring it up and we can
Cool.
kind of tease that apart. So
Should we start with the remix version, or let's start with this version and then I'll
yeah, just
we can talk about
interrupt
remix.
if
Yeah.
something reminds you.
Cool.
So like I said, like you have server actions, and you can write like a server action that feeds its action to a form, and you don't have any client component. Like you just like a server component renders a form, it passes in an action, and that action like adds some data to the database. And then when it's done, it refreshes the page. So like in Next.js, you can call revalidate path or revalidate tag to refresh the page. And my thing, every time you submit an action, it's just going to automatically refresh the page for you. But you can do something like that, no client components. And when you're running locally, like the experience is really good. Like you type, you hit enter. It's like 15 milliseconds to save. It's, there's no network to deal with. Database is all local. Everything's just fast. Then if you go into your server action and you just do like await promise, await new promise, set timeout, 1,000, wait a second, man, that experience gets rough. You now submit the form. You have like no feedback that your form is submitted. You have no idea that your server action is running. And then like all of a second later, like the data pops in. And then if you like, if you await like a random time, like 3 to 4 seconds or 1 to 3 seconds, like you just like, you have no idea if your app is working. And so like at this point, like you need you want to show feedback that the form is submitted. Yep.
Can I ask a question about that? Just that setup. So there's no client components in your app, but there is a React app running,
Yes.
and form, the element which you're passing the server action into, which you're rendering as lowercase form, kind of what we were talking about yesterday in the context of something else, really kind of should be thought of as a client component, right?
Absolutely.
Because the reason that UI is bad, what you said, is because you don't even get the browser's loading behavior. Whereas if you did exactly what you just said in Rails and you submitted a form, at least it would behave like a site that you would expect for the browser to know that there's a pending action.
Yeah, great point. Great point. I think, in fact, in the React, one of them, React DOM docs on React Dev, they say form is a component in React. So it is something that React
Client
is.
component.
They just say it's a component. Maybe
Yeah.
they say client component. I'm not
But
sure.
it's different than like a div. It's not an element. It's not like a JSX element. It's
Right.
it's
They specifically call it out, and so you can click it, and they
Gotcha.
talk about like what it does and so on.
Cool.
Okay.
So yeah, so the server action gets serialized, sent to the front end. That's another thing.
Yep.
And even though you're all in server components, you're still serializing the action because it has to be accessed from the front end. And now, if you disable JavaScript, I'm pretty sure that works too. But in a normal situation, it's serialized as an endpoint. By the way, that kind of like helped me. We were talking about how to get props from the back end to the front end, and they have to be serializable, and functions aren't serializable, but server actions are. And it's just the function is to turn it into an endpoint string. So I like that little. How do you serialize a function? You can't. How do you serialize a server action? You turn it into a URL. So the URL is passed to the front end.
It turns into, it's called like a server reference. It's an object.
Right.
Right. But I think you can give it a URL. I think you can stuff a URL in.
It's everything that the
one
front
of
end
the
needs
hooks.
to be able to call it in the back end over the network.
Yes. It's the magic of React server components being able to just have front end reach in the back end and so on.
Right. So then normally the front end is, when you submit it, is going to make the request, and then just like you would if you were doing fetch in a client app.
Yeah, exactly. So there's
and that's why you don't get any feedback.
Exactly. So there's JavaScript code that's running fetch to invoke that server action, and no browser feedback. So at this point, you're kind of like, I can't really build with React server components, right? Because there's no feedback. But I think React is like, okay, you have like state, you have an application that's running, like it's doing something, it's submitting a form. Like at this point, you should be comfortable dropping down to client components. And hey, guess what? We're going to give you hooks. We're going to give you a use form status hook that is going to show you that the form is submitting. So you can use form status inside of any form, and when that form submits, there's like a Boolean that hook returns that will flip to true, and then you can use it to like style your. I don't know. I usually like style my button. I put like a little loading spinner next to my button, disable the form. Just kind of give some feedback that we're working on it. But you still have to wait, a second, 3 seconds for the backend to process a request and re-render the page. But when you use like apps like Trello or really like any React app, I mean, like kind of the power of being a front end component application is you can do optimistic updates. So someone can just
liking a tweet.
Liking a tweet is a imagine if you clicked like tweet and you got no feedback until the thing actually liked. Yeah, and then it animated in. Yeah, so that's great example. And it's awesome. Like I think that's one of the reasons that we love React so much is that we can do these things. So use optimistic is React's answer to its hook to basically how do we do this. And the way it works is you can take a piece of server state. So let's say I've got a list of to-dos that come from my database. I can pass them into use optimistic, and use optimistic is going to give me back. There's a few ways to use it, but let's start with a simple case. It's going to give me back the same signature as set state. So it's an array. The first element in the array is the state, and the second element is set state. So I pass in data from my database to use optimistic, and I get back, optimistic to-dos, comma, set optimistic to-dos. And then I can go and if I'm running a server action or a transition, I can call set optimistic and I can add on to those to-dos. So I can say set optimistic, and it's like kind of the same, again, the same signature as set state. You can get the callback version with the current state and then add a to-do to that list. So this allows you, it's kind of like if you were going to, you might be thinking here, isn't this just how set state works, right? Like you can seed state off data in a database and then you can append to it by calling set state. And so that part is exactly like set state. So as you save to-dos, you can optimistically update them by calling set optimistic to-dos. That will instantly re-render while your server action is in flight to your server. But here's the really cool part. When your server actions are done firing, so after you've waited 3 seconds, after the to-do has been persisted to the database, in Next.js, you can call something like revalidate path. Maybe your server components just re-render. At that point, new data is going to flow back down to your client components, and it's going to go into that use optimistic hook. So now
which is in a client component.
Which is in a client component. So now the to-dos going into use optimistic, there's like a new set of to-dos. Now with use optimistic will say, oh, I got a new set of to-dos. I'm going to update like the internal state of this hook. And I'm going to give you those new set of to-dos. So this is where it differs from use state, because when you use state, that thing that you pass into use state is only used to seed the value. If you do like re-renders later on, like it's just ignored. It's only used to seed the state. Any changes that you want to make to state need to be made with set state. But with use optimistic, as it re-renders with new data, that data will flow back into the data to the parameter
The hook.
returned. Yeah, the hook will flow back into like that first thing that's returned from use optimistic, the state. The really cool thing is React doesn't do that like update phase until all your server actions are done. So while you're running server actions, you have the view of all the optimistic to-dos that you've like manually added by calling set optimistic. And then when they're done, your component should re-render with new server state, and that new state comes in and the hook then updates. So it's basically like you have state that you can write to optimistically, and you're going to be reading from that state while the actions are in flight. When the actions finish, React's like, okay, you no longer need to read optimistic to-dos. I'm just going to give you back everything that's in the server, which should now match up one-to-one, because it's like, you don't need optimistic to-dos if all the actions are done firing.
Okay, that's really cool. So really interesting. My question was going to be, is there some third parameter, some second parameter that's like an identity function that lets you tie responses from the server that are now canonical, that now have an ID or something that represents that they were persisted, like a created at, that lets you match the new server data with the optimistic versions and the client so that you don't stomp on each other. And they take a different approach where they just say, you don't update it until they all come back, basically. And that way you can avoid having to have a notion of identity.
Yeah. So imagine I'm firing off, like I'm saving like 20 to-dos. Some of them are going to come back at different times. Like they're all going to come back at once. So while all those 20 are in flight, my use optimistic hook is going to basically return what I originally started with in anything that's been optimistically added, but
Mm-hmm.
not things that have re-rendered since then.
Since.
But my component is a client component. It's getting data passed into it. That data will be updated. So I can compare my optimistic. I can compare my optimistic state with the data that's being passed into the component, and I can see those
Mm.
things start to update as new data comes into the
Okay.
component. So I
So
can
so
kind of
if
get
you
yeah. Go
you
ahead.
can derive that. So if you wanted some identity, and for example, you wanted to, let's say you check off a bunch of to-dos, and let's say you send a bunch of messages in Slack. When you send a message in Slack, it's at like 75% opacity until it worked, until it actually made it. And so that's optimistic UI, right? When you chat, you want it to batch them up and queue them up. And if you're like on the subway or something, you'll see it pulse, you know? And then if it succeeded, it'll become, opaque, 100% transparency. If it fails, it'll put it dim and it'll say try again. So what you're saying is if you had use optimistic and you pass in all of the messages and then you type 3 messages and hit enter really quick, that enter is going to call set optimistic messages. You're going to append those to the ones that are coming into the component, and now maybe they don't have an ID, or they don't have a created at. You give them a UUID, let's say, and they don't have a created at. So you know that they're optimistic and that you don't know if they've been saved yet. So now in the rendering in the JSX, you can say if you don't have created at, opacity 50, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you have 3 requests going out, and the first one comes back, but the 2 are still pending. So nothing has changed. The component has re-rendered, but optimistic messages hasn't changed.
Correct.
So your UI will still show a message, that first message that is now resolved successfully, that has now made it back. You've gotten a response for it. It'll still be pulsing. So if you wanted to make it not pulse, you want it to not pulse um, if if there's now a message from props. So the way you would tell if a message in optimistic messages has been saved is if it has a created at, or if it has an ID that matches an ID from something in props.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. 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 By the way, I thought this was like hard to explain, but you totally nailed that. Um, the same is true. Just to kind of build off this. Actually, when I talk about like what I did, I ended up passing in all the data. I let the like front end control all the data, and so I would generate an ID on the front end, UUID. By the way, which is super easy with the browser now with crypto random
Crypto.get
U.
random UUID. That's
Yeah,
exactly what I ended up doing in the remix demo, because
that's right.
as soon as you get into optimistic UI, no matter what tech you're using, you need some notion of client side identity.
Yep, exactly. Also, I use created at because for sorting, I didn't want to rely on the back end for defining
Out of order
created at.
requests and
Exactly.
responses.
Exactly. So that was an issue where I was like, wait, this is working, but everything's in the wrong order.
So you set created at the time of the creation of the optimistic record.
Yes.
Right.
I
Gotcha.
create
Yep.
the record, which is basically the to do text created at an ID, and then I give that to the server action, and then I also call set optimistic to dos
Right.
with that data object,
Why not just use the order of the array?
because when the results come back from the server, they could be in a different order because you don't know what order they're going to get. The server, you might have sent 1, 2, 3, but due to like slow network connection, so slow networks, the server got 2, 3, 1,
2. Right.
or only
Right.
2. You know.
Right. Right. Um,
Also, when I'm pushing into the optimistic array, I do pass a boolean there. I say pending true, just so my UI code can say like this thing is something that came in through like it's an optimistic to do, right? Because if all to dos have a UUID, a created at, and a text, you need a way to distinguish which ones
right.
came from the server. I guess you could do like a diff where it's like it's not
Yeah,
in the
so
server
what
thing.
I'm looking at my remix code right now, and I have to-dos from useLoader data, which would be the props in your case that you pass in, and then I have optimistic to-dos. And so what you could do that with the hook where you just, and then all to-dos is literally just array dot 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 to-dos comma dot 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 optimistic to-dos, and then render from that array instead of putting the server data into use optimistic, all of it, right? So it's just, but it's the same idea, right? You're
Right.
you're saying
I would
there's some
say
way that you're splitting these things up.
use optimistic basically does that step for you where it combines server to-dos or the server passed in props in this case with the optimistic to-dos that you set. And then as long as there's a server action in flight, it's going to say, okay, like I should keep these optimistic to-dos around because I don't know
Right,
if they've
but
been, I don't know what's been persisted yet.
right, but then you have to add the pending thing. So this would be a way to avoid that, I think.
Yeah. Also too, like I said, like I just kind of hacked this together. Maybe
Uh huh.
you get rid of pending by you look at server passed in to-dos and you say, take all the optimistic to-dos and filter them by the ones that aren't in the server passed in to-dos. And that's how you know all the ones
I
that are in
wonder if
flight.
you need to even pass in the original ones in
You
there.
do. You do.
You have to.
You want
Because
to
why
because
couldn't optimistic to dos start out empty, and then when you create a to do, you set optimistic to dos, and then you join that.
great question. Because when all the server actions are done, there's no more server actions in flight. Use optimistic throws away all the optimistic data you've set and just relies on the prop that was passed to use optimistic. Because at that point it basically says
Yeah, but at
I
that point they would be in there, and then so the
well
joined
that's what but
array.
I'm saying that's why you need to pass them in. Because it's like use optimistic parentheses server to dos close
Mm-hmm.
parentheses.
Got you. Interesting. I'll have to see. State. Mm-hmm. State is called optimistic. Mm-hmm. State. Cool. I'll have to check this out.
It's very cool. I guess too by like
Mm-hmm. I see. So the demo here messages they pass in the canonical server side set of messages every time. I still don't understand why you would have to do that. Why not just I see. I see. I see. I see. I see. Okay, I get it now. This is why it's different from Remix. Okay, so
yeah
in Remix, it would be as if you just call use optimistic with like an empty array. You can call set optimistic message with the new one, and that's kind of it. And then you can do your diff or whatever. But then you have to resolve differences between, you have to yourself handle the case where message one came back as saved and it's in your optimistic UI. So that's where you need a notion of identity in Remix. In my case, well, you use the client side ID anyways. You do need that anyways. But when you derive the optimistic to dos from the state that you have, or in this case, the fetchers that you're rendering, an array of fetchers, their data, and then you do a disjointed set or whatever, right? Between
hmm
that set and the props from the loader data. And if they have the same ID, then you take the one from the loader. But this is the way that React can say, this is the canonical set. And so wait, explain this again. I'm getting
yeah
tripped up. I need to see it in code, but how do they remove it? They That's right.
it's a
They update the prop when the thing gets re-rendered, and they do it by batching. Okay, now it makes sense. So it's a way for them to take on the burden of calculating whether something is in the client as a source, is the source of truth from the client side optimistic record, or is the source of truth now the server side record. And they can do
yeah
that because they batch it. That's the secret to the whole thing.
well that they also know that you have a server action in flight. So that's like the beauty. If there's a server
Right.
action in flight, you have to rely on the optimistic to-dos because you don't know what's been persisted and what hasn't. If there's no
Right.
server action in flight, then like the optimistic to-dos are, I guess they're like meaningless at this point. All you have is the notion of what's on the server. There's no
Right.
action in flight. There's no data that's changing. So there's no need. There's like no optimistic UI at that point, if that makes sense.
So it's interesting. I wonder if it's really optimistic. It's used for optimistic UI, but it's really like use in-flight server action data.
Use data that the client. It's basically like the client now owns this state.
Yeah.
This state was passed in. These props were passed in from the server. They came from the server. But now I'm doing some mutation, so the
Yeah.
client has to own this
Yeah.
state because we
It's a
don't
source of
know.
truth.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but then when the server comes back and says like I didn't save this or I did save this,
Yep. They blow it away.
now we no longer need the client state. So it's
Right.
almost like this kind of
A
like
refresh.
this
Yeah.
state that lives between both the client and server. And because you know if a server action is in flight, you can say, okay, now the client has priority.
I
Oh,
was thinking, yeah, yeah.
it's
I was
pretty cool.
thinking another way you could think about this is like putting a key on that root component of like last updated at from the server query. You know, the last message that was persisted, the ID. And if it was just key ID and you use normal React state, it's almost the same idea. Where if the server data refreshes and you have a new ID, React will key it, and if you key something and change the key, it blows away the local state. You start over again. That's kind of one way, another way to think
That's
about
a
it.
that's a great way to think about it. I guess the problem that you would run into with that is like your component couldn't have any other state.
Right. Exactly.
So
Exactly.
yeah.
Yep. Yep. Interesting. So yeah, very similar. At the end of the day, so this is how I think I would teach what you just told me, which is you start off with the messages, you have the delay, you add use optimistic, you pass in messages, and then you call set messages, run your server action, and you're still rendering for messages. So at this point, your entire UI is optimistic. It's going to feel
You're
instant,
rendering
but you
from
don't
like
know
optimistic
whether you're
messages.
rendering anything that has been persisted yet, right? Or if it's something from the optimistic set. So at this point, you need to add some notion that differentiates the two. Either you have a new prop that only exists on a new property on the object that only exists on messages that have come from the server, or something that only exists on the messages that are in the client. And so you said you did pending true, basically.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I did pending through. I'm not sure if that's necessary. Maybe there's like a better way to just kind of get rid of that state. The other thing that I found really interesting about this that kind of tripped me up was
By the
that,
way, I just sorry to interrupt you.
yeah,
They have sending true in the docs here,
yeah,
so I think that's fine.
cool. The other thing here that kind of tripped me up is that when your server action is done running, you blow away all the optimistic data. And so the server data becomes a source of truth now. I mean, it's literally like the thing that use optimistic is going to return is going to be the server data. So if a to-do failed, it is no longer in the server data and it's the optimistic data got blown away. So you don't know, like it just disappears from your screen. You don't know
Interesting.
that the to-do failed. So I ended up creating another piece of state that is basically to-dos that I've added this session, like to-dos that I've added right now. So when my when my form action fires, I set optimistic to-dos, and then I add the to-do to a piece of local state, and then I know that if the
It's
to-do
in the local state, but it's not in there.
it's
Then
not
it's
in the
failure state.
optimistic state. Exactly. So if it's in the local state, if it's in the server state, and if it's not in the server state and it's in the optimistic state, I know it's pending. I know it's in flight.
Right. Right.
In my case, I also just use a pending Boolean, but I can derive that there.
Right.
If it's in the added to-dos, but it's not in the optimistic to-dos, I know it failed. And it's pretty cool. You can then just display, you can basically combine the to-dos you've added with the optimistic to-dos, sort by created at, and you can create a little UI that has a button that says retry, and that's just going to refire your server action, and you start the whole process over again. It was pretty cool. Like I definitely had like a little magic moment there.
That's awesome. We'll link to your tweet. It's really cool. Interesting. How do you feel about that? Having to add another piece of state for that? Did you feel like there should be a story where? I feel like inherent to doing optimistic UI is dealing with the case where there's an error, which is why again it almost feels like this hook should be called use pending server action data, which is more similar to, and maybe I'm just because the first time I did this with Remix, Remix gives you fetchers, and you can use fetchers in a single component to render an array of fetchers. A fetcher represents like a form, something that's going to make a form that's going to make it that request contains the status of the request, the data on it, whether it has come back in an error, what's the state of it, error or success. But it doesn't have the idea of batching in the same way. You can make that yourself.
Wait,
but by default,
what do you mean by batching? Because
so use fetchers will re-render every time any message changes its state back and forth. So if you send 1, 2, 3, and then 2 comes back, you're going to get a re-render. Use fetchers is going to have that data, but message 2 is going to be in like a fulfilled state with the data, right?
yeah, and server components will do that too. If you like your server action called in Next.js, if your server action called revalidate path,
You'll
then
get the new one as a prop.
you will get the new one as a prop. Hey everyone, Ryan here. I just want to mention a little correction to this episode. I had talked about how you can use Optimistic and you can compare it to server props to basically see which props have been persisted while you have server actions in flight. Turns out that that's not true. And use Optimistic and your server state that you pass into your client component are only going to settle once all your server actions have finished running. So I think this might have been what Sam was talking about when he was saying that, you know, the Remix people had some objections or some things that were hard to do. It's probably this idea that if there's any server actions in flight, you are not going to know if they're done until all of them are complete. Okay, I hope that makes sense. I still think Use Optimistic is an awesome API, and I hope you enjoyed this episode.
But if you, so, and this is the other thing. It's now added to the prop, so it's in the prop and it's in use fetchers and Remix, whereas it still will be in use Optimistic in React as well until they're all done.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So, but the default case here with use Optimistic is you send 3 messages, 1, 2, 3. They come back to the client in 2, 3, 1 order. But if you have a pending true on those, you're going to see them all 3 at 50% opacity until they all finish.
Exactly.
Which I kind of like because it's fewer states and I guess it's pretty cool. But by default in Remix, you're going to be updating it every time. And you derive the optimistic messages as the diff between what's in the fetchers data and what is from the loader data. And there's actually a little comment I have here when I did this. Race condition only include pending to-dos that haven't already been revalidated by earlier fetchers. So if the ID is a string and it's not in the loader data, then I'm going to push it into this optimistic to-dos array, which is like a fetchers.reduce. So it's kind of like one or the other. You have to do more work in the Remix case because they don't batch. You have to do more work in the React case if you wanted those 3 things to appear as soon as they were revalidated.
As soon as, yes. Server. Yep. That's totally fair.
both of them work. Both of them can obviously handle both cases of UI. But I kind of like the batching built in because
the reason that I think the batching.
So I have a question. I have a question. Okay. Again, it's a pretty clever way to avoid identity. So you have 1, 2, 3. You have 0 messages coming in from the server, and then you go ahead and create 3 optimistic messages in your form, and you do it in 1, 2, 3. Now 2 comes back first. You're saying because the server action that was used to create 2 calls revalidate path or revalidate page or whatever, that component is going to re-render. So you re-render. Now the message is prop to the page component, has 1 element in it. But you're passing that into use optimistic right away, and you're rendering from the return value of use optimistic. So because 1 and 3 are still in flight, that is still going to be an empty array. It's not going to re-render that. That data is still going to be the messages from use optimistic is still going to be the 3 optimistic messages.
Exactly.
And they're all going to have pending true. So the fact that 2 resolved doesn't affect the return value from the use optimistic hook, which means that your render value is going to be the same, even though the prop has changed.
Yes.
And it's not until all 3 happen that you then, the use optimistic hook now returns the 3 messages from the server, and they're not going to have pending true because that was added in the action.
You blow away the optimistic state, and you only rely on server state. That use optimistic
But
is like
still
an update
through the
through
hook,
use
through the hook.
optimistic.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yep.
yes,
So that's a way that they've been able to basically say you don't need identity because you're not updating specific elements in the array based on when the responses come back or not, right? It's literally as if you refresh the page.
yes.
It's literally as if that's the way to think about it. You refresh the page, and now instead of the messages prop having 0 elements, it has 3. That's the way to think about it.
Yeah, yes. Dude, the light bulb moment again for me here was it's basically who owns the state. So if there's no
Right.
server actions in flight, the
Right.
state should be the props from the server. If there are server
Right.
actions in flight, the client now owns the state because the client knows more. Like think about it. At that point, as soon as you submit a form, the client knows more than the server because the
Right.
client
Right.
knows that
Right.
the data is on its way to
Right.
the server, but the server hasn't gotten that message. The server doesn't know yet. Once all the server actions are done running, there's no server actions in flight. Who knows who's the best source of truth? It's a server. It's pretty. I don't know. It's pretty. I thought it was pretty
Pretty
cool.
interesting. Very
Now,
cool.
now, just to like, I have no idea how. I think if I was going to build something like Trello, where I had multiple lanes, and you could update cards, and you can drag and drop cards between lanes. I think I would have one like giant reducer. So that's another signature to use optimistic. You can use like the reducer signature. I think I would have one giant reducer at the root of basically all these components, all these client components. And that thing would be basically use optimistic with a reducer pattern to update state. So which lane is a card in, that would have to go through there. Basically, there'd be one reducer that has to know everything, which cards are being renamed, which cards are being dragged between lanes, which ones, what is it like you're now in lane 3 because you're like optimistically in lane 3, like which, and I feel like, I don't know, I feel like that would be kind of hard for me to do with this API. I feel like it would be a lot of code. Maybe once I do it, I like unlock a few things in my brain. I'm like, oh, okay, now I better understand it. But it was definitely a thought I had where it's like, oh, okay, so we're gonna have like reducers with a lot of state to build something like Trello.
Well, basically, the UI is being driven from the return value of useOptimistic. So now, if multiple components pages need that, you need to hoist it up and pass it
Yeah.
down because of the knowledge it has about server actions.
Use optimistic like is a reducer that mimics your database. So you're dragging cards and you're updating like parent card
Right.
and lane ID and whatever your data looks like, but it basically becomes a reducer
Right,
version
because
of your
you're
database.
saying as if you were building Trello with Create React app, you're gonna have an array and you're gonna have a bunch of things that call set state, but those set states need to like reorder things, and it's gonna look the same thing. It's gonna look like
Yeah.
the same thing.
And then
It's kind of
eventually,
a cool. It's kind of a cool. I was just wondering why. Go ahead. What were you gonna say?
well, I was going to say, and then eventually all the server data settles,
Right.
and then you just render from the server.
Right. I like that part of it because that part of it is nice. And I was trying to think why they went with this design as opposed to something like Ember Data or Remix. Because in Ember Data, models, which objects here, records, whatever, are thought of as atomically. So you save a message, a message, a message. Each message is stateful and it knows about itself. It knows if it's in flight, it knows if it succeeded, it knows if it erred. And it's the same with these fetchers conceptually from Remix. Whereas this is not like that. It just
Can I
blows it
can I
away. So when you
can
blow
I
it away,
interrupt?
yeah,
Can
go
I
ahead.
interrupt here though? But like, you might be right, but you might like you and I as app developers might reach for like a optimistic hook library that uses all these things under the hood, but we're not writing use optimistic from
But
React.
the big difference though is like when the thing I like about this design is that when the messages have all come back, if you use this in the way it's meant to be, you're never gonna have a situation where you're showing something stale, I guess. Because if you refresh the window, that's the mental model. It's as if it's the same thing. And so you don't rely on your optimistic records being updated to make sure that they represent the server side versions of them. So once they succeed, you
Yeah.
literally blow them away. They're gone.
Yeah.
They're gone.
Yep.
So that's that. There's a I think there's like a nugget there that's like this makes it a bit more forgiving and robust or whatever. If you have some logic and instead of saying like, oh, now I can render. I have my original 3 messages that were loaded at the time of the server. I have these 5 that were created optimistically. I'm rendering them together. But I am showing in the UI that the 5 optimistic ones were saved because it's, they have like a dot save true or something like that, or they don't have a pending false. But I had to make that pending false change once they came back. This one just says, boom, blow them away. And for that kind of thing, you always, again, needed the identity, whereas here you don't. So the reason I say I think that's nice from like, it feels a little bit more robust is imagine you posted messages and you sort by created at, but someone else put a message in while in between your 1, 2, and 3. So now you have 1, 2, and then your 3 is actually a 4. And you probably wouldn't sort by created at on the client, right? Because ultimately a chat log, a transcript of a chat log is going to be sorted by when the messages were created on the server. If this is just a single user, it's one thing. But if it's a multi-user thing, ultimately the server is going to render that back. So let's say you use Optimistic, you send the 3. You have like a client created at that used to order them, so that it's like your best guess about what order they'll be in. But now another message came in between 2 and 3. And the client doesn't have any more pending stuff. So now you get a re-render and you're going to see the 4th message. You didn't have to add any logic to handle that. You didn't, because that record wasn't created by you. So you didn't have to do anything. You're writing that in the same way you would write it as if on an initial render.
Right.
How do I do it?
Because
I feel like that's the idea.
Because the server's the source of truth at this point.
Yes.
And so
exactly.
let's just treat, exactly, the initial render.
You remember in Ember, like there was times where the server is a source of truth and they update the models and stuff, but you're still rendering like this client memory object thing that like,
totally.
it knows it was saved 2 seconds ago or whatever. It might have a link to another model that is optimistic or a draft or something like that. It's different than if you were to refresh it right away. Whereas this is saying, and this does feel more lower level, so I kind of understand what you mean by that. It literally blows it away.
That's a great point, because like in Ember you have models and maybe you're editing your model, but it's pointing to a record that's like has a relationship to a record that's like already persisted, and that relationship just works. Where like with useOptimistic, I feel like to get that where you're like creating lanes and then dragging cards into lanes before they're even been persisted on the server. Like you basically hoist everything up into a reducer, which actually, like, as I say this, I'm kind of like, oh, that's scary, but it's how you would write a client-side React app. You would hoist the state all the way up to that, like no database whatsoever. You'd use reducer and have like a reducer database action-y thing.
Exactly. And the other thing is that if you drag it and it kicks off the actions right away, there's something nice about the fact that the server actions, again, the hook comprehends that the server actions are pending. And if it comes back, if all of the server actions come back and you re-render with the server-side state now, you blow something away, and like one of your updates didn't make it, you kind of did something wrong. Because let's say that you were doing this kind of join thing where I'm doing this myself with my own state. These 3 cards move, but then the rename didn't happen because I didn't hit save or something like that, and you didn't know in the UI. If I had my own local state, it could be the case where you refresh and you lost that. But now it's kind of like it's forcing you to refresh this every time you're in an idle state. Every time the client app is in an idle state, your UI is going to look like it did if you refreshed.
Yeah, that's great, dude. That's great. You no longer have this like crutch of like temporary in-memory optimistic objects. Like you should have no more. It's basically saying like you should have no more optimistic objects at this point. And so we're going to overwrite all your optimistic objects. Pretty cool.
Interesting.
Yeah. I will say that
we only have a few minutes left. I had one more thing I was curious about, but if you have something,
well, I was just going to say on like your comment about reloading the window, I really like that. But if your to-dos fail to save, they fail to save, that now they literally only exist in React memory. The server doesn't know about them. So you will lose them if you reload the window. But I guess that's to be expected, right?
It's the same as if you were building a form and it failed if it was in React state. If you build a form, it's either in the browser state or React state. But if you submit something and you haven't thought about what to do in the error case and you refresh, it's not going to be there. It's client side temporary data or whatever. Or if you, I guess the analogy here would be like if you went to a GitHub issue, started entering a comment, clicked somewhere else and came back, and you're like, "Where's my comment?" At that point, you have to think of what you want to do there. So this is the same idea. It's a similar idea because when you go back, it's like re-rendering from the server. And so now I want this to be a stateful. It's a draft message. It's a draft comment. And so I'm going to put these into drafts for the reason that being that I want to restore them potentially. Don't have the user type them in again. But the use optimistic being this thing that lets you avoid the notion of identity of matching your temporary client records to the server ones via some notion of identity. It's pretty nice. That's pretty awesome. And they're not going to end up in both. That's the thing. There's never going to be a version, a copy of a record that ends up in both the server props and the props that come back from the optimistic hook.
Yeah, I guess just to like caveat that, like while things are in flight, that might happen, but when things are settled, correct.
Right. Sorry, you don't have to worry about the message, the data that comes back from use optimistic, including duplicates, even though it
Yes.
includes all of
Yes.
the things.
Yep.
Um,
And
which is
just
pretty
real
cool.
quick, we'll throw a link to the code for my little to do app, as well as like the tweet that has like a little video of how it works, and you can kind of people can look at it. And again, this was like just like a 2-hour dive into this.
Yeah.
Just wanted to. I was like, hey, this is coming soon to React. I want to learn about this, and so
I'm liking these dives, man. You know, our last one was a deep dive on React Cache. This is a bit of a deep dive. I feel like we have more to cover here, but
Oh, yeah.
deep dive on optimistic, and there's a lot of cool stuff coming to React. The last thing I'll say, maybe we'll talk about this next week, is that I know that there some of the Remix folks who saw optimistic. You know, Remix has had optimistic for a while before React had a notion of an optimistic hook, and there were some use cases that were hard to pull off with use optimistic. I think it had to do with the fact that use optimistic has an implicit connection to like a form. You don't. How do you know which form, which server? How do server actions get linked to use optimistic? Is it all server actions in the app, or is it server actions that were submitted from the nearest ancestor form?
Oh, I think it's probably going to be all server actions in the app, but I haven't tested that. But I'm guessing it's going to be all. I'm guessing it's going to be if there are server actions in flight, you have to rely on the client side optimistic state because things are in flight. And yeah, you might want to know like, hey, these actions over here finished, these actions over here are still running. They're two different UIs, so like settle them at different times. But yeah,
So
I don't.
anytime you call a server action in, what did you say, a transition or
You call a form action, so it's like a client component that calls a function that's passed a form action or a transition. So anytime you are running a server action, anytime you're running an action or you are transitioning, that's the only time you can use optimistic. If you try to use optimistic outside of that, it doesn't make sense. That's probably state.
and if you had two components in two different parts that were siblings, they didn't share anything, and they both had forms and they both had use optimistic, and you do in component A, you run the server action, you run 3, and they all come back. The batch is done. React is going to update use optimistic with the new data. Is the use optimistic over here also going to say like, okay, time to basically like time to like blow it away?
I think, well, there was nothing optimistically added to the one over there. So there's nothing to blow away. It just maintains.
What if
its
there
state.
what? Okay, gotcha. And what if 1, 2, 3 over here? Those are done, but then you hit 1 over here. It's still going to wait. Both of them are going to wait.
I have not tested this case, but I would
Gotcha.
imagine, yes. I would imagine React would say something like, listen, there
The
is
whole
data
app
that
is
there's
still
a
the
server
source
action.
of truth.
Yes, there's a server
Yep.
action that's running. Therefore, we know more about the server. When the server comes back to us and gives us new data, at that point the server knows more. But right now we know more. So
Interesting.
maybe this is something also
Interesting.
too.
Cool.
This might be a feature that they end up adding and they supporting. So I am not the expert. I am not like the the best person to talk
Yeah,
about
yeah, sure.
those
No, no, I
cases.
was just
But
curious because it is a very limited API, and so I think that might have been some of the cases I saw on Twitter where this was how you would do this with the use fetchers in Remix because they all have their own state. There's nothing that coordinates them all together. So it's more like Ember data in that sense, I guess. You could have one part of the app that's like updated, and if it was all updated, you could show it,
yeah,
even if another part was slow. Whereas this is like a simpler API in the sense that it's just solving the one case.
and again, this is why I kind of started off this conversation where like I wouldn't want to be in a cage match with Ryan
Right,
over
right, right.
building like an optimistic UI, and this, and maybe over the years like tools get built on top of use optimistic that can compete. But I just feel like right now I would just like I'd make a mistake with it. I don't know. Maybe there's more to explore, but yeah.
Cool, man. All right, well, let's wrap it up. Thanks for listening, everybody. If you have anything you want us to talk about, hit us up at Front End First FM on Twitter, and we'll post a link to your Twitter video in this show notes. And also, you posted on YouTube a video about cache, which we talked about last week. So we'll share that as well.
Cool.
Otherwise, we will talk to you all next week.
Cool. See ya.
All right, see ya.